Welcome to the Deer Wizard Podcast, conversation shaping the deer industry. I'm your host, Josh Newton, the Deer Wizard. Through interviews, advocacy, and industry news, we deliver field-proven insights to help producers build better herds. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Deer Wizard Podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you so much. We appreciate you. We're at all your audio platforms for the podcast version, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to us. We got a great show lined up today. I got Mr. Mike Suttle from Sinking Creek Whitetails. Mike, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Man, I appreciate you coming on. I've known you now since you kind of got into the business, but why don't you give folks a little bit of background on yourself? Kind of when the private deer industry space came into your brain, when you got deer, all that stuff.
Right. Yeah, so from the time I was a little kid, I've known I wanted to do something, have some way to control. I remember reading when I was my first Outdoor Life magazine, reading about quality deer management. And I thought, wow, what a novel idea. And we own a fair bit of property by West Virginia standards, nothing like, the ranches in Texas where we could control everything because we had 500,000 acres. But, we had a couple thousand acres. So, but even then, the idea of a quality deer management program with neighbors who weren't on board was just a pipe dream. And I knew that even as a young age. So early on, I discovered, wait, if I could build a fence and control what was inside and more importantly, what happened, I could keep them from going outside and meeting their fate as yearlings, So I wanted to do that early on. The cost was, never, it's not something I could ever afford early on. And so I moved back to the farm after, a early career doing other stuff. I moved back to our farm in 2007 and built this house. And literally the day I moved in, I said, I'm ready. I'm going to start researching like how to proceed from here. So from 2007 for probably 12 or 13 years, I researched deer farming a lot before I put my first post in the ground or did any of the official paperwork. So I've known for a long time I wanted to do it, but I just was able to pull the trigger and put the first post in the ground in 2020, early 2020, and got that all wrapped up towards the end of 2020.
Yeah, that initial like inspiration when you were a young kid was based off of the outdoors and hunting, I'm assuming.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I've been hunting since I'm old enough to remember, but
yeah.
Yeah.
It's so interesting because like I this is the truth. I do not know anyone in the deer business, at least personally, that did not enter into the deer farming business from a hunting perspective. Like everyone I know, just like hunters, fishermen, outdoors people.
Absolutely.
And they like caught that, whatever that bug is that I personally think it's like just in our DNA to interact with nature like that.
Yeah, I agree.
And like it just like that was always the transition in.
Yeah, for sure. So and it had nothing to do with gain, with monetary gain whatsoever. I never even once considered the fact of how much money could be made. I just knew how much it was going to cost to do it. But my love for deer and being able to see them and interact with them every day, not just from October to the end of December when I'm out in the woods looking for them, but being able to be around them every day. That's what motivated me to do it, or the desire to be around them like that every day. It had nothing to do with money at all, and still doesn't for me.
Yeah, it's that I can't get enough of being around deer feeling, whatever that is. It's hard to explain to people, but I know you started doing some tours at your facility, and like, can you see like maybe the change in people when they come to when they leave, and like just spending a couple hours with you, riding around the ranch and stuff? What's that like?
For sure. Most of the people that come here are on board with, they follow our page, they see us bottle raising fawns, or they see some nice pretty deer bucks out in the pens or out on the preserve. And so like the majority of people that come here kind of in support of what we do. But there are some outliers, and those are the ones that I really like. The people that come here, maybe their kid wants to come bottle feed a fawn, but they themselves don't agree with the concept of deer in captivity. So when those people come, it's really rewarding for me to see the change and like a father who comes with his daughter that wants to bottle feed a fawn, but the father comes here with a preconceived notion about deer farming is bad.
Hmm.
And inside of 2 hours, he leaves and like apologizes to me on the way out. And it's like, man, I had no idea. This is the coolest thing ever. I really regret having, made the comments I made about deer farming being bad. After seeing it, it's a lot cooler than I thought. And then that makes it all worthwhile for me. All the people that we argue with on social media, the ones that show up here and actually get to see it firsthand, those guys almost always leave with a different opinion than how they arrive, which is cool, especially when you take them out on the preserve. And, you tell them we got 50 deer out here and we drive around for 90 minutes and we see 4 and from 100 yards away, they turn and throw their tails in the air and run over the hill. And they're like, wow, you mean you can't just shake a bucket of corn and they'll all come running up to the side by side, and that's the image that they have, I think.
Yeah.
It's really cool to see that.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I want to talk about, I want to get into your prior to deer life, but before we do, I'm curious about the 2007 to 2020 period when you were doing your research, because like I've talked to enough people now, and of course, we have some fairly good size deer farmers groups on Facebook. That seems to be the social planet for the deer farming world.
Yeah.
And you see people, coming into the space and they're excited. They want to, I want to get deer. What do I need to do? That kind of thing. And so what took you so long, Mike? Like what was it? Like, give us the full kind of playbook of what that, 12, 13 year time frame looked like for you. Because obviously you were an outsider at that point. You knew what you wanted, but you didn't have it in place. So what took that decade of time?
Well, when I started researching, I wasn't even a member. I wasn't even on Facebook, at the time. So I would just go on the internet and just I would just find websites, which is, much slower way to do it than, Facebook is certainly way faster and more convenient. But, I would find a few websites of deer farmers, and I would just call them and talk to them about, look at all the pictures of all the deer they had and talk to them about, the pros and cons of deer farming, what it takes to get started. I would go visit. I visited as many deer farms over that, say, 12-year period. I visited almost every deer farm that was current at that time inside of West Virginia. And then towards the later part of that timeline, I went out. We travel a lot with our police dog program. We travel all over the country doing seminars. So I started kind of tying that in with, if I'm doing a seminar here in Texas anyway, I'm going to look up a couple local deer farmers and go visit them. Or if I'm in Indiana or Wisconsin or, all over the place. It got to the point almost where I would say, hey, there seems to be a big number of deer farmers here in Indiana. Let's see if we can schedule some police dog seminars out that way, just so I have a reason to go out there and visit some farms. So, it was a combination of a lot of internet research and a lot of farm visits. But, I don't want you to think that I was spending 12 hours a day for 12 years researching deer farms. It's something that I knew I wanted to do. Early on, I spoke to a very nice lady who was, her and her husband were, and I wish I remembered her name or the farm name. This was many, many years ago. A deer farmer in Pennsylvania. They had really nice looking deer. They were very nice. I mean, when I told her my situation, I'm a police dog trainer. I've got a 44 dog kennel here, and it's a constant, rotation of dogs in and out, hundreds of dogs a year, And, she was like, well, I can tell you right now, unless you're willing to build your deer farm on another piece of property, there's no way you'll be able to make that work. I was like, that was like a shot in the gut to me, man. I was just devastated. I was like, oh my gosh, that's what I really wanted to do. I mean, I can't stop training police dogs. That pays the bills, but I really wanted to do the deer farming thing. And then when I heard that, I was like, so that set me back a little bit. Like I kind of just closed the book and backed up and said, I guess I can't do it. One deer farmer said, I can't do it. I can't do it. And that was obviously not true, but
yeah, that's interesting. So, I know I call it like the gateway into buying stuff is usually like purchasing semen prior to getting deer. I've seen a lot of people
Oh yeah, and
do
I
that.
did that.
Did you?
I did. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I did as well. It's
That's the
so,
only thing I could purchase without a license, so I started there.
um, so what additionally, like, what was the planning phase like when you were like, okay, like we're gonna start doing this? Of course, you had your farm and ranch visitation, so you got to see what these operations look like. But what were the practical things that you were doing, just prior to 2020? Like, okay, like I got to source poles, I got to do this fence design, I got to think
Yeah.
about this staged approach because it's expensive to start a fresh farm, right? So
Oh yeah.
what did that look like for you?
I wish I could find it. I've got it, and I could find it. I don't have it with me, but I have a folder, like a binder, that probably has. I did a Google image picture of our farm, of the area where I wanted to build or start building our pens and our handling facility, and I just I took a picture of that. I burned like literally probably 100 photocopies of that, and I just took out a ruler and a protractor and I started designing pins around that property, and I had 50 different layouts, all different.
Mhm.
And then I joined some deer farmer groups, and I was just posting pictures and getting feedback from them. Like, okay, this is what I have to work with. This is one idea I have. And some people would say, yeah, that's stupid. Throw that away. And I would just and once I narrowed it down to a few designs like that, but I mean, that took, I don't like to just jump into anything, without a plan. So that took a long time to develop a plan on, there's some things just because of the lay of the land that, you say, well, I have to have my handling facility here just because of the proximity to power and water and, everything else. So now that I know this is where our barn and our handling facility has to be, how can I design the rest of this layout to make that work? And it's very efficient for us. It works well. I probably would still change some things, but that's what it looked like for me was, like sourcing the materials, post and fence. I had already prepared for. What I didn't plan for in my budget was gates, the
Mm,
cost of gates and the number of gates.
yeah.
Like if you would have, as a farmer, as a fourth generation cattle farmer, if you've got one pasture, you may have 3 gates, right, on a big pasture. I go through my deer pens, and every pen has like at least 4 gates, and some have directional. I mean, like the number. I think I had when I started at my first build was like 5 pins with an alleyway, 5 pins and like 30 gates. And if you tell anyone who isn't a deer farmer that, they're like, how does that even make sense? But
Yeah.
that's what it is,
Yeah.
and gates are expensive. So like when I was doing my budget on, this was pre-COVID, so wooden posts hadn't gone astronomical yet, and fence was, I don't know, $450 a roll at that time or whatever. So I based that on the number of rolls of fence to do 5 1-acre pins and the number of posts required with, for that in an alleyway. And I came up with a number, and I was like, yeah, okay, I can do that. And then I had to add the number of the gates, and I'm like, shit, I can't do that yet. Like that's a whole nother, that's equal to the cost of the fence and the posts almost,
Yeah.
so. And then, the water, the Nelson waters and the handling, I bought all that stuff. I bought the handling facility used, but
Mhm.
the chutes and scale boxes and that stuff. But I mean, all that stuff is stuff that, like, the barrier to entry there is definitely cost. If it would have been cheap to do, I would have done it, in 2007. But
Sure. Um, all right. So I think that's a good place to transition. We're going to step away from deer. I want to talk about, you had mentioned training police dogs. So I think this is an interesting topic because there's a large breeding component. Because like for me, I guess outside of like spending time with the deer and being on the farm and doing the work, um, breeding deer and genetics is like my favorite thing. I think
right.
it's kind of like it's not something you can touch. So it's a I guess ethereal would be a good word. It's something just it's an image, it's a picture, it's a dream, it's a vision, right?
Yeah, it's a
And
gut feeling a lot of times.
yeah, and I think that part of it, probably because I can't touch it, is the most captivating for me. And it's like, I don't know how many before we got on, I was just kind of working on my pedigree book. So I try to just, print out my stuff and have my DNA sheet so I can take a book to we're heading to the top 30 here in a little bit.
Okay, sure.
And so I just been writing some of the 2026 fawn pedigrees out so I can like see them on paper. And that's always been really interesting for me. So tell us about your dog kennel and like what it is that you did and you do, and we'll search our way back into the deer world.
Yeah, so it's similar in that it's all about genetics. It's 100% about genetics. The same things that us as deer farmers have to listen to. When people try to unfairly compare wild deer to captive deer, and well, if we fed them the same thing, they would look the same, or if we kept them in the same enclosures, they would look the same. Well, obviously, we know that isn't true. Well, it's the same thing with dogs. People tell me all the time, well, why are you traveling to Holland to pay thousands of dollars for these green untrained dogs when there's perfectly good dogs in the shelter sitting there waiting to be adopted and trained? And I'm like, man, I wish it were that. It would save me over the course of the last 30 years. It would have saved me literally millions of dollars if I could have just gone to the shelter and grabbed any random dog and trained him to be a police dog. But it's 100% determined by genetics. I use an example of like Michael Jordan, for example. I'm sure if a football recruiter had gotten a hold of Michael Jordan early enough and gotten the desire to play football in his head, he would have probably gone on to play in the NFL because he is an athlete. He's a top tier level athlete. And that's what I'm looking for with dogs. I'm looking for dogs that have that genetic potential. Going to the shelter and grabbing the first random dog you see, it's not about training. It's about the genetic potential of that animal, because no trainer can ever possibly exceed the genetic potential. No different than deer. No deer feed can exceed the genetic limitations that the deer has in his DNA, right? No matter what you feed him, he's not going to go from the 200-inch genetic potential to 600 inches of genetics. And a dog that is, has the genetic capability to do something at this level, no trainer on the planet can take him to this level of training to make him, you can't exceed their genetic limitations in training. So, we had to figure out how to select dogs that were easier to train, that were best suited based on success rates. If we go to Holland and pay a lot of money per dog and pay a lot of money to ship those back, and not only shipping, but customs fees. And, there's a lot of things that go into getting a dog landed back here from Europe. If that dog doesn't work, that's a total loss. So you have to be, if your living depends on it, you have to be really good at identifying genetic traits and looking around kind of creative training that some trainer may have done to kind of mask some genetic problems. You have to be really good at identifying raw genetic talent and raw genetic traits. And then from a breeding perspective, that's what you want to breed for, because there are some fantastic trainers that can take dogs with some genetic flaws, and with enough training in a controlled environment and like pattern training for certain evaluations, you can kind of mask some of those flaws. So if you have a very well-trained dog that has genetic limitations, and you breed that to another very well-trained dog but also with genetic limitations, what you produce is dogs that are genetically limited that require top-tier training to even get to a minimum standard. What I try to do is find dogs with no training that can truly show me their genetic potential, and then only breed with dogs based purely on their genetic potential and their genetic capabilities without factoring training. And trainability is certainly one of those genetic traits, but just raw genetic potential. And it's going to be things like health, obviously, but, drive, courage, athleticism, speed, intensity, and when I say drive, that simply means the desire to, right? So like a dog that has a strong desire to use his nose and find things. Some dogs are far more driven to do that than others. While all dogs may possess the ability to use their nose well, there are some dogs that possess also the desire to go out and do that. And there are other dogs that may have the ability, but they don't possess the desire to do it. And you can't train desire into a dog. So we're trying to breed dogs with those traits. And I saw years ago the writing was on the wall. Every year in the working dog industry is huge. It's still small compared to the pet dog industry, but it's significantly bigger than the deer industry. And so the writing was on the wall early on. I would go to Holland every 6 weeks and buy as many dogs as we could find that passed our selection test. But every time I would go over there would be more vendors over there shopping, and more vendors because, trainers are really creative, not just in America, but worldwide. So when I first started buying dogs, there was no dogs that were being trained to find cancer cells. There were no dogs that were being trained for arson detection. And these are just some examples. And so it seems like every year or every couple years, there's a new use for a dog's olfactory system, which means that the supply remains the same, but the demand is going up every year. As a matter of fact, the supply is actually going down because most of the dogs that we buy come from working dog trainers in Europe, working dog people in Europe. And that's the dying breed. Much like deer farming, there aren't very many 19-year-old deer farmers that are taken upon, unless they inherit a farm. There aren't a lot of 19-year-old farmers that are jumping into the deer farming industry. They're jumping into the technology industry. There's a lot of 70 and 80-year-old deer farmers that are retiring, and there aren't replacements coming up. And it's exactly the same way with working dog breeders and trainers, because that's a lot of work. Mm-hmm. It's easier to sit behind a computer and make a living than it is to go out and stomp in tracks for 18 months, seven days a week, sometimes at 2 a.m, So the working dog trainers and breeders is a dying industry, and the desire or the need for working dogs is continuously growing. So I saw that 20 or 30 years ago. I could already see that. And so what we started doing was we started purchasing, as we always did. We always buy the best dogs we could find over there. But instead of bringing those dogs back and selling them immediately, I started collecting semen from the males and holding the females back to at least get one litter of puppies out of them before we placed them into their roles with special operations or wherever they were going. Because what happened for the longest time, we were going over there and we were buying the absolute best dogs that existed. And we're bringing those dogs back and selling them to government agencies where they were essentially removed from the gene pool immediately. They were never allowed to reproduce. So, imagine going into the NFL and taking all those top tier athletes and castrating all of them, and then expecting the next generation to be the same. It won't happen. Those are genetics. And when you remove those pipe hitter genetics, you're left with a watered down version. And then over time that pays, that has pretty adverse effects. So I started, getting the best dogs we could buy, collecting semen from the males, getting a litter or two from the females. And I would buy them young enough that I could still get a litter or two and still sell those dogs, and recoup my money on them. And now I would have, a litter of puppies to start to evaluate and weed through and select the ones that were similar to their parents, and then concentrate our efforts on those. And so now, fast forward to where we're at today, we buy very few dogs from Europe anymore. And the vast majority of the dogs that we have in our kennel were produced here from the last, 7 to 10 generations of breeding with our own animals. And that's the biggest difference, I think. I can take one female, and if I wanted to really push the limits, like, in the deer farming industry, it's not uncommon to take a big fawn and breed her the first fall, right? That happens. You can also do that with a dog. It's not an advisable practice, but you can certainly take it. Most dogs will come in heat at 6 months old. So if I wanted to really push the window, I could take a 6-month-old female dog, breed her the first heat cycle, say 6 to 8 months. 63 days later, she's going to give me 10 puppies, right? I could do that twice in that same year. So theoretically, I could take a 6-month-old dog, and before she was 12 months old, I could get 20 offspring from her, sell her as a 12-month-old dog, and now I've got 20 offspring to work with. That's the biggest difference and the hardest thing for me to adjust to when you switch back to deer, because you can't get 20. You can't take one doe and get 20 offspring from her in a 12-month window.
Right.
So, and not only that, but 8 weeks after that first litter is born, you can get a really good snapshot into the future of what the genetic potential is, because an 8-week-old puppy still shows the same traits, not as pronounced, of course, but I can look at an 8-week-old puppy, and if he's got terrible nerves and no drive and none of the traits that we're looking for, very seldom do those traits materialize, at least to the point where we can use them, successfully. But if I got an 8-week-old puppy and he's got great nerves and great drive and a big motor and he's super athletic and agile and he just crashes around like he owns the place, those are some of the early signs of genetic traits that we're looking for. So not only can I get 20 puppies in 1 year, I can by the time those puppies are 8 weeks old, I can know if my breeding plan is working or not. Obviously, that's not the case with deer. You can't look at an 8-week-old fawn and say, yeah, for sure, that breeding, we knocked it out of the park with that one. And you don't have 20 to compare it to establish a good, accurate database. So there's some big differences there. But it's in terms of, understanding how genetics work, and it's still a gut feeling. I've been breeding police dogs. I'm 52 years old now. I bred my first litter of working dogs when I was still in high school. So I've been doing it for a long time. And even if I go out and do a breeding, like I've got a female that just came in heat yesterday, and it's still a little bit, we compare pedigrees and we do the best we can do on paper, but at the end of the day, it's still a little bit of a gut feeling, and I don't know that will ever change. And it's the same way, even talking to some deer breeders that have been doing it for 40 years. I had this conversation with Levi Mast, who's one of the oldest on the East Coast doing it. And he said the same thing. He said, yeah, you do your best you can, look into pedigrees and you kind of make predictions. But at the end of the day, it's just what does your gut tell you? What cross do you think will work the best? And certainly you build that gut feeling based on 40 years of experience, but it's not always right. Sometimes we do breedings that, for me, a successful breeding is going to be at least 80% of my puppies go on to do some type of working job role. And if I have to wash out 60% of them, that's not a successful breed. No matter how good the one or two outliers from that litter were, if 60% of them don't work, that's not a successful breeding. And after doing it for 30 plus years, occasionally that still happens. That one didn't work like we thought.
Now, what kind of dogs are these primarily? Is it all just one breed?
Mostly Malinois. Yeah. Dutch KMPV Mal. Dutch KMPV is a police dog certification in Holland, and it is by far the highest level of working dog standard. Relative to police work, the Dutch KMPV program is head and shoulders above the other police dog programs throughout the world. So that's where
why
their standards are just higher. And the testing is much more difficult. So much so that until very recently, KMPV wasn't even allowed in America because American wouldn't allow that culture. It is a violent test during some of the working dog, some of the patrol dog tests. It's tough.
Yep.
There's dogs that get their necks broken in training and in testing pretty regularly. So the Americans don't like that. There's dogs that routinely get their teeth ripped out of their head or their jaws broken. And, so, it's a very, very tough test. And I didn't go to Holland because I like the Dutch people better than the French people or the German people. But when we started shopping around in Europe, we traveled to every European country, because in Europe, you can literally ride a bicycle, and go to 5 different countries. And so, if I'm going to be in Holland anyway, I'm for sure going to go and test dogs in Germany or Hungary or France. They're all Sweden, Switzerland, all over the place, Finland. And because it's just a quick flight to go, test those dogs in all those places. And consistently what we found were dogs from the Dutch KMPV program had an overwhelmingly higher success rate when we were doing our testing. So we still buy dogs from other countries, but I buy any good dog I can find, but the number of good dogs that we were able to find in Holland were significantly higher than the number of good dogs that we were able to find in other countries. So that's where we did most of our shopping. And I'd say 95% of the dogs in our kennel today all trace back to Dutch KMPV dogs. We have a couple dogs from Germany and a couple dogs from other places further back in our pedigrees, but the vast majority of them come from Holland. It's just like when you're breeding deer, you come up with a plan of what type of deer you want to produce. And it may be completely different than what I want to produce, or completely different than what someone else wants to produce. But once you know what you want to produce, that's where you go shopping for deer that have a history of producing that type of deer. Well, I knew the type of dog that I needed and wanted, and our clients needed and wanted. And that type of dog came from Holland. So that's where I went, shopping for those dogs.
So is there any issues with like genetic diversity? Do you, like, when you're evaluating, obviously the dog physically, mentally has to meet your criteria. Is there a criteria on paper that it has to meet? Like, what does that process look like?
Yeah, on paper, there really isn't. And that's another interesting thing about the Dutch KMPV program, and what separates it from like the German police dog program is because in Holland, they don't adhere to a physical standard, and the dogs don't have to be registered. What they say in Holland is we need dogs that have drive, health, enthusiasm, commitment, good grips, good noses, dogs that really truly want to work, and dogs that can hold up to 10 years of very vigorous crashing around, because that is a hard job for a dog. You're talking about a 80-pound dog running 35 miles an hour, smashing into a 200-pound man over and over and over again in training. That's where a lot of dogs get injured. They get their teeth broken out, they get their jaws broken, they get their necks broken. So the type of work they do, there's a natural selection process. Like the ones that aren't capable of doing it well usually end up dying on the training field. Mm-hmm. So the ones that live and go on, they do well. So they don't care about paperwork. They don't care about if the dog is registered, for example. Whereas in Germany, for example, they have standards for a working dog, but it also must be registered. So what that means, Josh, is if you have a male and I have a female, but the third breeder over here also has a male, and I decide I want to use a male to produce a litter of puppies, if I'm doing this in Germany, I have to use your male because he's registered. Even if this male over here is a better quality example of a working dog, I must use yours because he's registered. If I'm in Holland, they throw that crap out the window. They say, I don't care about papers. I want to use the best possible option we have. I don't care what it looks like, what color it is. I don't care if it's a 50-pound dog or a 105-pound dog. And in some of those other countries, they're not nearly as, they're not like the AKC in America, whereas, they're kind of producing dogs that fit a physical standard exclusively without any regard to working traits anymore. They're not that bad, but the FCI, which is the European version of the AKC, to simplify it, they still require a paper trail with registered dogs. And there's nothing wrong with that, except for when it comes to the point of breeders that are making decisions that are omitting what they know is a better option for producing a working police dog. They're omitting that dog as an option because he doesn't have a pedigree or he's not registered. The Dutch don't do that. And the end result is exactly what you expect. They're breeding for one thing, and that's working quality. They don't care as much about registration, registered dogs. And you see that, I know a lot of Amish farmers that produce gorgeous deer, and you got to go, some of those deer have not ever been registered with any organization, but doesn't mean they're not pretty deer.
Mm-hmm.
And, so like we also breed Labrador retrievers for our narcotics and explosive detection. And like, so the lab industry, the best working police dogs for criminal apprehension all come from Europe. Originally, all traced back to Europe because they've been doing it for 80 years longer than we've been doing it in America. But the one thing Americans definitely do right is anything related to hunting. And so when you're looking at Labradors, you can't beat an American field trial Labrador. You can go to British labs and these elite English labs and whatever. There's a lot of other countries that breed labs, but for a true working lab, none of them compared to an American field trial Labrador. So with our lab program, they're all registered, and all the paperwork is very much in place, much like it would be if you were a high-end deer breeder registering everything through NADAR. All of our labs are registered like that. None of our Malinois are. And there's a reason for that, because for the most part, now I've seen some really good registered Malinois, but when I'm overseas looking at dogs, the number of registered Malinois that may look a little prettier and have a little nicer coat, the number of those dogs that I can chase out of the building and run them behind your car, cowering with their tail between their legs, is way higher than the unregistered dogs that we test off the KBV fields.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So I want to take that knowledge and experience that you have, and I want to shift back over into the whitetail world. So what are some of the things that you found helpful from that background with not only training police dogs, but the selection process specifically, that you find just keep coming up again and again in the deer world for you?
Yeah, that's a really hard metric for me to measure. One, because I'm so new to the deer farming industry, compared to yourself or most of your followers. But also because it's, you can't go out and evaluate a deer the same way that I can go out and evaluate a police dog. My evaluations of deer consist of, which does consistently produce fawns that live, and fawns that are big and robust and healthy. And even after only 6 years, there are some does that I can say for sure tend to produce fawns that are healthier and more robust, and they just thrive better. They gain weight better. Even sometimes their coats look better. And I think it's just a picture of overall health. There's some deer and some lines that I've already seen that produce a much healthier looking deer fawn that matures into a big, strong, healthy looking deer. So for me, it's going to be about health, I guess, more than anything. I probably care less about antler size than any of your followers or anybody you'll ever interview. I don't care about how big the antlers are. I care about what the antlers look like. I don't care how big they are. But I do like big bodied deer, and I like healthy deer. I think everyone can agree we all like healthy deer. But I believe that, I think that there are some people that are maybe sacrificing a little bit of health in exchange for giant antlers. I prefer a big, strong-bodied, healthy deer, and if they have 180-inch antlers, I'm fine with that as long as they're pretty. A 180-inch 8-point for me is about as nice as looking deer as anything. So I don't really care about antler size, but I do care about health, and I'm starting to learn that there are some genetics and some does that I have that consistently produce bigger, stronger, healthier fawns. So those are the genetics that I'm trying to align, on our farm. But yeah, it's really hard to, when I'm looking at a dog, there's, so many traits that stand out, that are easy to select for. And when you're looking at a deer, it's more difficult. Especially if I were to go to, if you're watching the deer on your own farm over a 12-month period, you can establish a better baseline. But if I'm shopping for a deer and I go to another farm, going back to if I go to a dog kennel in 15 minutes, I can evaluate a dog and tell you a whole lot about that dog. If I go to your farm and evaluate any deer on your property for 15 minutes, I can maybe tell you which one's the biggest or the fattest or has the prettiest set of antlers, but I can't really tell you much beyond that. So it's very, very different, at least for me. I haven't been breeding deer long enough to be able to walk into a pasture and say, yeah, this is the deer that's going to produce bigger, stronger, healthier fawns. And so for me, that's the most important thing, is big, strong, healthy fawns.
Yeah. So let's take that metric and set it aside, because that's a once a year thing, right? So what do you think maybe some of the things are that would be beneficial for a shorter term evaluation?
Yeah, sure.
What do you think maybe some of those things are?
So like this time of the year, no matter how healthy a deer herd is, it's not uncommon to see a deer cough. occasionally. When you get huge temperature fluctuations and you got 30-degree rainy days, and then it jumps to 65 degrees and sunny for a day, and then it's 19 degrees 12 hours later, when the sun goes down. That's very stressful for a deer. And I see some deer, even in my own herd and in other herds as well, I see some deer that will start to show some early, I don't know if it would be signs of pneumonia necessarily, but signs of some respiratory stress, right? I see coughing occasionally. And if I can go out there and set for 2 hours with the binos and watch, and maybe I got a handful of deer that'll cough randomly, but after a 3-week period of that, I'm like, there's these deer over here that have never once done that. They've never coughed a day in their lives. I've never seen a runny nose. I've never seen them cough or anything like that. That's something that I kind of look at, or I look at a deer that one thing that is important to me too is temperament. Deer are supposed to be wild. I get that, but there are some deer that are extremely wild and tend to produce extremely wild offspring, despite me bottle feeding them all. I've got one of my favorite older does from the first group that I got is a Joey boy daughter, and I don't know anything about Joey boy's temperament, but this Joey boy daughter is absolutely feral. She's big. She's a big, gorgeous doe. She always produces big, gorgeous fawns. And I've even taken some of her buck fawns and bottle raised them because she produces feral behaving offspring. I mean, deer that they're crazy, That's not ideal for me, especially with a 44 dog police dog kennel within 100 yards of the deer farm. I don't need a dog that I don't need a deer that even if it's bottle raised is bouncing off the fence every time a dog walks down the driveway. And some of our does, I notice, are more prone to that and producing that. I don't want this to turn into a commercial for your farm or your deer, but I will say, man, I don't have a Roman offspring that is crazy. Even the bucks that weren't bottle raised, they have a very, I don't know if it's confidence or if it's just, but they just aren't, they're far more stable. I mean, yeah, they run to the back of the pen when something crazy happens, but they're not bouncing off the fence over and over and over again just because a car drove in the driveway. And I've got some deer consistently that behave that way. So again, it's a learning curve for me, but if I see a deer that produces big, healthy bodies, pretty antler expression, and a temperament that doesn't get himself killed because he's so stressed out and so panicked, he either just dies from stress or he dies because he ran into a fence and broke his neck. When I see deer that exhibit those traits consistently, I kind of migrate, in that direction as well. I don't want to start listing names of deer that I don't like because of, obviously because of looks or behavior, but there are some that I have already seen consistently, or pretty consistently, produce deer that I don't like.
Yeah.
On the preserve, it's not as big deal, but
yeah, it's I suspect that Joey Boy doe would do great on the ranch, right?
We're going to find out. She's a GG doe, so she doesn't have as much. It's hard for me because, like I said, she's one of my favorite does on the farm. She produces beautiful, typical offspring, and that's a deer that she's been here from day one. I've never seen that deer cough. I've never seen that deer get pushed around by any other deer. She's a very, very nice quality doe, and she'll be great on the preserve. But and the other thing is she doesn't take the AI, so that's kind of a bummer too.
Yeah, I had a doe like that I really, really liked, and I AI'd her 4 times, and all four times she didn't take the AI. And
same with this one.
At that particular moment in time, AI was a big tool for me.
Right.
And what I did find interesting is I was just breeding her to the best buck that I had at the time, and she was just a hammer, right? She just pump out big son, big son, big son. Now at the time it was a game of inches, and she was good. She was good at that. But generally speaking, all the other qualities that she had were really good, outside of the fact that I couldn't get the desired crosses that I wanted from her because she didn't AI. The good thing is that many of her daughters did not exhibit that trait. And I guess I was just too stubborn to give up on her, so to speak, because I liked her so much. So maybe there'll be that one offspring, like one doe that you get out of her to some cross that you wanted, or that is acceptable to push the breed forward, that is a little more chill than her. But that's interesting that you've isolated that trait, because how it's like almost like nervous energy. It's a survival instinct.
Yeah, absolutely. With wild deer, it would be a desirable trait, but with a deer in a 1 acre pen, it's the goal is to keep them alive, and it's harder to keep a deer alive when it's bouncing off of every fence post on the property.
Yeah, and they rile up the rest of the deer too. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like they're just, deer are like, they still have that herd instinct to them, and they cue up all the rest of them. You get one nervous Nelly in there, just kind of, hey, what's going on? What's going on? What's going on? And the rest of the deer are like, well, we should probably take our cues from her. And
especially if it's a big, dominant 6-7 year old doe, they're absolutely going to follow what she does.
Yeah. All right. I want to shift into the breeding program a bit. I noticed that you've been pretty, I'll call it harsh, but not in a bad way. You've been really harsh on the deer industry deer, and you've selected animals for a certain antler characteristic, and that's typical, right? And so you've made some comments like, if he's 180 and he's clean and he looks nice, that's great for me, right? And so what is it about that mindset that you've kind of identified and stuck with? Like, why is that?
It's just a personal preference, and I, like I said in the beginning, I'm not motivated by money with this, right? So like if I was trying to actively sell deer, I would probably put my personal preference aside, and I would look at what the industry wants. What do all the preserves want? And maybe then I would be a little more aggressive in trying to produce larger antlers. I'm not trying to breed deer to sell them. And I'm not even really trying to breed deer to hunt them. At some point, my preserve can only hold so many animals, and at some point we're going to have to harvest deer. There's no question. And if it becomes a matter of I harvest the deer and put it in my own freezer for zero income, or I sell it to someone who's interested in harvesting it for a little bit of money, that's probably the path I will take. That makes sense, right?
Yep.
Something has to pay the feed bill. I can't rely on the dog kennel to support my deer habit forever. Yeah, but I don't want to breed. I already breed dogs based on what everyone else wants. You know what I mean? Like some of these types of dogs that we breed are difficult to live with. And I personally, like if I wanted a personal dog, it may not be the same type of dog I'm trying to breed for the Navy SEAL teams. So I already breed dogs that aren't exactly what I myself would want. I don't want to also breed deer that aren't what I myself like to look at. The whole reason I have deer is because I love deer. I love looking at them and watching them. And I have had some even my big non-typicals were still not big compared to the industry standard for big today, but I've had 350-inch deer that were, had 40 plus scoreable points. And those personally, they don't do anything for me. I like that left side of that buck over your right shoulder is exactly the type of look that I want to have. That's what I want to look at, because I'm breeding deer for myself first and foremost, and not for the industry or not for preserves to buy. I breed what I like to look at, and what I like to look at is, I kind of have this, I've kind of adopted this slogan, deer that look like Mother Nature intended. I say that a lot, and that's real. Like that's what I try to produce. I like looking at deer that look like a bigger version of what Mother Nature intended. And if you look at the bigger versions that Mother Nature has produced, like the General, like the Milo Hansen buck, like the Huff buck, like the Jordan, there's a lot of deer out there that are just as big and just as pretty and just as clean and typical as some of the biggest clean typicals in the captive industry. Now, certainly when you go to the non-typical side, there's no comparison, but the generals 200 and, depending on what you estimate the spread credit, 230 inches. Show me a captive bred 12 point, 230 inches that, they exist, but there's not a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a lot of 200-inch 8 points, even in captivity. So there's Mother Nature has produced some absolute typical giants, and that's what I'm not trying to exceed that even. I like to have a preserve full of deer that look like the general or the handsome buck or the huff buck, And if I had that, I'd be completely, and that's why I use deer like Roman, because he has that look.
Yeah. Have you found the selection process difficult?
Yes. Yeah, it's hard to find those deer, first of all, and it's, even when you do find them, it's very hard to get those deer to produce. If I start with I'll just use these examples. I've got sandstone daughters. We're breeding to Roman, both beautiful deer, both very clean, typical deer in the 200-inch range. Sandstone was right at 200-inch 8 point last year. Those are rare. I could do that cross 50 times and not get anything that looked like sandstone or Roman.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's hard to do, but we're just trying to stack all the deer that I like the looks of. And I'm having some dilemma, a little bit of internal conflict now, because a lot of those deer are not SS deer. And I've got a tank full of big, pretty deer that are GG deer that I maybe shouldn't be using, but I still am, because I'm still chasing that look. But my hope is, if I stack big clean typicals to big clean typicals to big clean typicals for 5 generations, I'll be able to produce with somewhat consistent big clean typicals. But like I said, I'm 6 years into it, so I'm not going to give anybody advice on breeding deer.
Yeah,
I know less about that than anybody that's listening, probably.
Well, I think again, I'm an outsider to your I only know what I can see online and based on our conversations, but you've been really, I use the word critical, but again, not in a bad way, for your own program. You've been very critical with the selection process, and I find that it's a challenge for me to find. I think there are some clean. I think there are some clean deer, but they don't have the exact eye appeal that I like. Like, there are clean deer that maybe just don't have the proper shape, right? That mother nature shape, and that selection process is difficult. There's sub 50 deer in the country that I would be like, yeah, I would breed with that. And then we add in the CWD and regulatory landscape, and it blows up a program, right?
Right.
And so I just, I too probably have the same internal dilemmas, right? You mentioned I got a whole tank full of GGs. I want to keep using them, but there is a point where you have to say, I have to start adding some S's in. I need to add some negative GBV value, just for longevity purposes, right?
Sure.
And I think everybody's situation is probably a little different. You live in I'll call it a pro ag state of West Virginia. They're an ag regulated business to raise deer, and you have if you needed to, you have your farm and your ranch that could be self-sufficient. And even if you got CWD, they may be in the mindset with the technologies that we have today to allow continued operation, right?
Yeah. And West Virginia is really, really good about that, in support of the deer farmer.
Yeah. I just the whole CWD thing, it really throws a monkey wrench into pure breeding, right? Because there's probably deer that I wouldn't have bred with had CWD not been a factor in that equation. And so do you I suspect it's always on your mind. How are you starting to navigate that?
Well, as you know, what you're alluding to is the difficulty in finding northern deer.
Yeah.
I assume that's what the difficulty, like I'm trying to produce big bodied deer. Well, we know that for the most part, the northern deer had bigger bodies, and I'm concentrating on northern deer because I want to keep those big bodies. It's very difficult to find northern deer that are truly clean and typical deer that look like Mother Nature intended, that are also SS, that are also below the cutoff for breeding values. That is like, counting your northern aggression buck, I know of two.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just not very many of them.
Yeah.
Not there's more than two, but there's not a lot. You can go to any random farm in Texas and probably find more typical deer with SS markers and really deep low breeding values than you can go all over the north. The breeders everywhere in the north, you couldn't come up with as many as a big ranch in Texas would have on their one farm. So certainly it's hard if you're going to be strictly breeding towards SS, which we are, but not as strict as some places. Like we AI'd 21 does this year. 10 of those does were either SS or GS, and all of those 10 were AI'd to SS only bucks. Now, some of them still had higher breeding values than what I would like, but those were all pure northern bucks. So I'm getting the cough. So some of those bucks had breeding values that were a little high, but they were all SS bucks at least. So that's the start. And then the other 11 does that we AI'd were GG does. And I didn't, because I don't own any SS breeder bucks here myself. Now I have 7 buck fawns that we're going to hopefully select a couple breeder bucks from, but currently I don't have any. I got some Texas SS bucks, but I don't have any pure northern SS bucks here to live cover with. So I'm going to use the term waste semen, and I'll explain what I mean. So when I have those 11 GG does, I didn't want to waste good SS semen on a GG doe, knowing I wasn't going to produce SS offspring. So I used some of those really pipe hitter hammering GG bucks that I've had in storage for a while on those GG does, with the intent just being to turn them out in the preserve. And I'm not as aggressive about that because we're still 100 plus miles from CWD. As you said, the West Virginia is pretty lenient as far as, even if it were to show up, man, sorry.
You're right, buddy. Get a drink.
Yeah. Even if it were to show up here, it wouldn't be the end of the world. And even if it were the end of the deer farming world for me, it's a hobby, right? It's not going to affect my income at all. So I'm not as aggressive about producing 100% SS herd immediately as some farmers are. But like I said, about half of what we bred this year was SS does or GS does to SS bucks. And every year that number will increase until probably over a 3-year period, everything in our breeding pens will be SS. Now we'll still have a lot of GG and GS deer out on the preserve, but by that point, it'll be time to start harvesting some of those deer, and we keep the tags in them when they're out there so I can easily identify which deer does have the least desirable markers. And as we remove those deer, we'll replace it with SS deer from the breeding pen. So eventually, we'll get even on the preserve. But the big push right now is getting our breeding pens to, all SS deer with good markers. So step 1 for me is all SS deer. I'm not even to that point yet. So I'm going to get all SS does first. And then we'll start to I'm hoping that more bucks like, Cletus's Silver Sword or your Northern Aggression, Greg Fleece just, they produced a deer this year that's like got really deep, low negative breeding values as a yearling, big bodied yearling, pretty typical right now. General Lee, I think is that deer's name. That's what I'm interested in. He's got a little bit of non-typical stuff in his pedigree, and based on how big he is as a yearling, will probably be a little less typical next year. But he's got like negative 0.2 or something SS. And Greg said it's the biggest body yearling he's ever produced there. And like, you're talking about several generations of producing some absolute giant body deer. So for him to say that means that deer is big for sure.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting, and so I'm hoping that with every year now, there will be a lot more northern SS options with good breeding values. And That's what I'm banking on, at least. I'm not willing to jump down into using a lot of smaller bodied deer just yet, but CWD lands at my doorstep. That's where I'll go for sure.
Yeah. And I think for me, and maybe this is true for you, but like when we say like northern deer, we just mean big bodied deer.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's kind of I've it's maybe it's a misnomer, right? Like maybe we're just characterizing it wrong, and it doesn't mean that there aren't some I don't know if it's native Texas deer or native southern deer that don't, I'm sure there's some big bodied animals, right?
Yeah.
But like if you've ever looked at there's this thing called Mendelism, right? So I think it was like Richard Mendel, and he was breeding plants, but they were peas, and so he took dwarf peas and giant peas, and
yeah,
he cross pollinated, and they got offspring, and 10% of them were giant, and 10% of them were dwarf, and everything else sat in the middle.
Yeah.
And so I haven't read it in a while. I need to look at it again. But like basically it was, even if they're like for us, I think even if there is some quote unquote Texas blood in there, it doesn't mean that through generations of selecting that we can't maintain body size.
For
But
sure.
what we don't want to do is we don't want to take a 200-pound doe that's, reached pinnacle size for us, right? Is a goal achiever, breed it with a Texas buck, and they get 130-pound does, right? It's just a massive regression of a genetic trait we're trying to increase. Sure. So I've been very selectively trying to add a little bit of quote unquote Texas deer into my herd, because man, like they got the look. A lot of them got beautiful. The look.
And it's the options when you look at SS deer that are below the cutoff, there are at this point probably thousands of options. All of them are beautiful.
Yeah.
I have this conversation with Cletus every time we get on the phone together, and that's been his big internal conflict as well. He's really pushing hard to get good markers and low breeding values and stay with a typical look. And if you're breeding to sell deer to preserves, it doesn't really matter if you're producing 350-pound bucks or 280-pound bucks. They're still big deer.
Yes.
If you're producing 120-pound bucks, that may be an issue, but I don't think anybody's really doing that.
Not 120s, but 3 and 4 year olds that are 180.
Yeah.
That's not out of the realm. I've seen some bucks that are 3 years old that are, multi-generational Texas bred that are, 180 pounds. And like, I'll call that mature. I know it's not a mature deer, but like for our industry, 3 years old's mature.
Yeah.
It's the beginning of the maturity stage, right?
Right. It needs to be big by 3 if it's,
and like
it's going to have value to you.
Our bottom tier is like 225, right? Like those are about the smallest, and most of those are 2. But like, we're not selecting those for breeders, right? Like, they gotta be robust. I mean, you got that. What's that? Is it Thunderbolt? Thunderstruck. One of those.
So Thunderbolt. It's a womb brother to Cletus's Thunder. Cletus has Thunderstruck. I have Thunderbolt. They're brother. Yeah, and that buck was big. 264 pounds at 2.
Yeah, he's a tank. Big like you could just look at him and be like, ooh, he's just solid. Yeah. When their neck's as big as your waist.
Right.
It puts perspective on things. And so his offspring, I suspect, are big, stocky, nice looking animals.
So far they're looking good. I don't have any 2-year-olds out of him yet, but I've got some 200-pound yearlings out of him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's big enough for me, for plenty now.
Big.
Yeah, those are big yearlings.
Yeah.
No, I've got I think 2 does that are out of big stitch daughters. So they're, about 50% Texas genetics. And one of those is really big. I'd like 185 pounds or something. I mean, for a
Mhm.
50%, she's a big doe. She would be a big doe if she were pure northern. But
Yep.
the fact that she's out of a big stitch daughter and she's still 180 pounds or something, I'm real happy with that. And I've got another one that's smaller, 150 pounds or something. Still not a small doe. She's 50-50 cross. I've got one doe, 6 years old, 110 pounds. She's mostly pure Texas. In fact, she's line bred on touchdown. She's 110 pounds at 6 years old, and she gets bullied by every doe in the pen. She struggles in the winter up here. You know, we're pretty high in the mountains, so we're not as far north as you, but we're 3,800 feet or something at the top of our preserve. You know, so it gets cold and it's really windy and a lot of snow up there. And she doesn't live on the preserve. She also doesn't take to AI, so I would turn her out on the preserve, but I don't know that she would survive out there.
Coyote bait.
Yeah, she's really little and she gets beat up by everything in the pen. I typically put her with every year when we wean our doe fawns. She goes in with that year's doe fawns, and by this time of the year, some of those doe fawns are as big as her already, and some of those doe fawns are already starting to push her out of the feed trough. And so like, if I were to go real serious with producing pure Texas deer, I would literally have to build a separate pen for them here. With our buck, like I've used some Texas bucks on those 50-50 cross does, and those offspring, now they're 3/4 Texas. They are noticeably smaller. Those yearlings, every year I lose an average. Over a 6-year period, I've lost 6 yearlings, bucks, to fighting. All of those have been Texas cross bucks. They get their necks broke by either yearlings that outweigh them by 50 or 60 pounds or by 2-year-olds that outweigh them by 100 pounds. So like, if I wanted to do that and have success, I feel like I would have to build a pen dedicated just for my smaller bodied deer. But yeah, you're right. When I say northern deer, I don't care. I mean, if I could find, 200-pound does, I don't really care. If they're 200-pound does and they're pure Texas, that would be fine with me. In fact, that'd be better, because
I was going to say that'd be awesome.
Yeah, but
I suspect there's probably some lines that are just,
I'm sure
are bigger, right? And
I'm sure there are.
There's probably encroachment out of Arkansas. I know, Oklahoma, right? And like, you get those Midwest Missouri genetics kind of filtering down over time.
Even Louisiana, like the river bottoms in Louisiana, like those, the Mississippi Delta type, they claim there's 250-pound bucks roaming around down there. I don't hunt down there, so I can't verify that, but they say there's some giants down there, giant-bodied deer.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that all southern deer are small, and probably I generate a lot of animosity, certainly from southern breeders. I'm sure they don't like to hear that. But like, if you just Google, Bergman's rule is a very real thing, right? Like, the further north you go, animals tend to be bigger.
They have to.
With the exception of, like, to give those southern guys credit, I'm from West Virginia, so I'm like neither a Yankee nor a southern guy. Like, I'm just a hillbilly from West Virginia. But if you Google, are northern bucks bigger than southern bucks, you'll get an answer, right? And I think you'll find that the northern bucks but change the word bucks to bass. Are northern bass bigger than southern bass? No way, man. Florida bass are twice as big as Pennsylvania or New York bass. Right? So, like, I'm not saying your kid's ugly. I'm saying, don't be mad at me, because I'm just saying Bergman's rule is real as it applies to whitetail species, and deer from the far north tend to be larger bodied than deer from the deep south. That's just facts.
Yeah, it's just an environmental observation.
But the prettiest deer I've ever seen in my life have been Texas bucks.
Yeah.
And I can, like I said, I mean, there's any random farm in Texas has more pretty bucks than what you'll find on most northern farms, So
and they're cool. Their coats are different. Their eyes are different.
Beautiful deer.
They I've seen just some tremendous animals.
That trait is,
from the south.
I used Flawless. I had 3 buck fawns out of Flawless a couple years ago. Now, he's not pure Texas. He does have some. He goes back to like Red Oi Bill and some Red Oi stuff on the top side. he's got some northern stuff in his pedigree. But I really like the deer. He's got good markers. He's got good breeding values. Beautiful deer. I got 3 buck fawns out of him a couple years ago. They were all gorgeous, and they weren't small bodied deer. They weren't my biggest deer, but they weren't. They were very normal sized yearlings. They were SS. They all had good breeding values. But the one thing that was consistent from day one, all 3 of those buck fawns, I really thought they were melanistic the day they were born. I mean, they were so dark, and their faces were as black as your shirt until they were 8 months. I mean, they were gorgeous, super, super tight coats, like steel gray as they matured. Without looking at their antlers, they were by far the 3 prettiest young deer on our property. But they weren't as big. One of those is one of the ones that got his neck broken. That happens, But yeah, I would use Flawless again. Again, he's not pure Texas, but that's an example of a buck that produced a lot of things that I really like, markers included, and not small deer.
Yeah, he's super awesome.
I love that buck. And I love his offspring.
Yeah, you would not be upset if you woke up every morning and you got your coffee and you looked out over your pastures and he or bucks like him were just standing there in the pen. You'd just be like, "Yep, cool." Yeah, because he's got that look. He's got all the right characteristics and shape, and he's just he's a stud for sure.
Yeah, I like him. And I'll probably use him again. The semen price jumped way up from when I bought it 6 years ago to what it is now, but I will probably use them again in the future.
Yeah, there's always.
I've got a lot of Texas semen that I'm certainly not going to sell or throw away. Like I love the look of those deer. I got to find the right time and the right place for it.
Yeah. It's and that's what excites me so much for the future is like. There's all these like little kind of hidden gems everywhere. Like you just never know what's sitting in a semen tank. You never know what somebody else is doing. Right. And like every spring we get new fawns and every summer there's new bucks.
Yeah.
Right. And or a new doe pops up that just created this next thing that you're just like, whoa, like I need a piece of that. And that's what makes it so exciting.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, Mike, I'm cognizant of time. I really appreciate you coming on and chatting with me today. I know that you're going to do well because I watch what you're doing with your breeding program and how you have attention to detail and health, and I'm excited for your future.
I appreciate that. I'm excited as well. I can't thank you. You were one of the first. Well, before I even bought the first deer, I think. Like I remember having a conversation with you. I was sitting in a Pizza Hut parking lot on the phone with you 6-7 years ago, maybe, talking about vaccines and herd health plans and stuff. And like you were one of my first advisors in this industry, and I really appreciate that. That's not lost on me. I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I try to help folks out the best I can. It's just a matter of experience, and like I want everybody to be successful, right? Because like not only is it good for our industry, but it's good for me because like I can not in a bad way, I can take advantage of other people's hard work, right? So like man, you pop that buck, I get to buy some semen from you if you got semen collected, and I get to incorporate your all your years of breeding into my herd. Like I only have so many animals, right? And so like that's awesome. And on the health side of things, it's important that we present ourselves to the public and to the industry in a certain way, and health is a great criteria to do that. Like what we do is, I think it's going to be important in the long run for whitetail deer. I really do. And I know that there's a lot of folks that, you call them antis or whatever. They don't necessarily agree with what we do, but I truly believe that the work that we do has relevance. It has importance to whitetail deer long term. And,
I agree.
I think we got to keep doing it. So
for sure.
Awesome. Well, Mike, again, thanks for coming on, ladies and gentlemen. With that, stay tuned for another episode of the Deer Wizard podcast.